When I started out all those years ago, I thought naively that crime coverage was about documenting and making the public aware of the most extreme human experiences you can have in society. And if you just did that in an accurate and engaging way, you'd done a journalism good. That's more of a bedtime story we tell ourselves and each other so we can sleep at night, because the truth inside it is so very ugly.
Our Bay Area innovator today is Scott Thomas Anderson, a journalist who has spent 18 months working as an embedded reporter with various law enforcement agencies.
I probably was split up between, over 2 years, 30 different deputies and officers. To my knowledge, I'm the only one of 2 reporters that's ever done that.
He's the author of Shadow People and producer of the Trace of Devastation podcast, covering American crime, the drug world, and the societal impacts of poverty.
The last 4 or 5 years, it's more death than I've ever seen in my career. Write their stories and see their stories play out. It's about cultures of hopelessness.
And his warning on tech addiction.
Certain companies now have created specifically relationship chatbots. Just imagine a near future where the bots are slightly better and they are seamlessly and ubiquitously and affordably merged with VR tech. What is the addictive power of that?
This is Bay Area Innovators, and I'm your host, Steve Espas. Scott, welcome to our program.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Well, you worked with the police department. You're a reporter, for 18 years, but you worked as an embedded reporter with different law enforcement agencies in the 2010-2011 timeframe for 18 months. Please tell us about what you actually did and what your experience was.
Well, I had a national grant out of Washington, D.C. that allowed me to be an embedded reporter I was on a rotation between 7 different law enforcement agencies in Northern California that were in 5 different counties, including Contra Costa County in the South Delta. And that grant paid for me to be detailed to officers and deputies on night patrols for 18 months. And as the project went on, I also started going along with detectives on warrant searches. I started going along on like parole sweeps and various other law enforcement operations. I a couple times watched SWAT operations from pretty close by, but
so you would observe the different operations and report on that.
Yeah, but I was mostly on detail to night patrols. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the project was about how meth addiction fuels crime in rural communities on such a level that it starts to degrade and disintegrate the quality of life in those communities. And at that time when the project came out, the conversation around methamphetamine was really centered on how destructive it was to the addicts and the users themselves, which is a real thing and a fair conversation. But there wasn't a lot of public discourse on how much crime it was driving against other people in these communities. Mm-hmm. So incredible amounts of property crime in these fairly bucolic communities that previously didn't have crime like that. But more tragic than that, it was driving a ton of child abuse cases, child neglect cases, elder abuse cases, fraud against the elderly, domestic violence. Meth was, in my day job as a police reporter out in the Central Gold Country, meth was the common denominator in the vast majority of child abuse, child neglect, domestic violence cases, and sometimes you would see it as a major factor also in homicides.
Yes.
Very personal, sort of friends, family members, people in a closed circle. Somebody kills somebody else because they've been doing meth for 2 weeks and putting nothing but that and Diet Coke in their body, and they experience amphetamine-induced psychotic disorder, and then they just do something horrible that they never would have otherwise done. So the book was really about trying to tell that story, but tell it through the lens of officers, and to a lesser degree, prosecutors and victims advocates in these rural communities who were on the front lines of all of that.
Yeah, and by the way, this is your book right here. Now, I think you mentioned how meth is, in that sense, one of the most dangerous, or the most dangerous drug in what makes people do. Fentanyl is probably killing the most people.
Yeah.
But meth is the one that makes people most dangerous. Is that right?
Well, meth drives the most crime. And I do think meth, there's a much higher likelihood if somebody's high on meth that they're capable of doing some act of violence that they might not do otherwise, right? Much more so than with alcohol or name the drug, right? Right now we have parallel epidemics in California. We still have the same meth epidemic I was writing about when I did all that embedded work with law enforcement. It hasn't abated, it hasn't gone away, it hasn't gotten better, and it's still driving a lot of crime in the areas I cover as a crime reporter today. But we also have this other epidemic of heroin and primarily fentanyl, and that is killing a lot of people. So with meth, the tragedy is the sort of overall destruction of a community and the quality of life in that community. Where fentanyl, it's immediate, direct, acute family tragedies. Yet very young people are dying with the fentanyl. But most of the fentanyl victims, and the last 4 or 5 years, it's more death than I've ever seen in my career. It's very young people. The ages are like 15 to 22, typically, with fentanyl deaths. So both those things are happening at the same time.
How were you accepted by the law enforcement agencies, by the police officers? Were you actually sitting in the car with them?
Yeah, for their entire shift.
How was that? How did that work?
We was on a rotation for a reason. So the idea of having me on a rotation between these agencies and different officers and different deputies, part of that was so no one individual would just get sick of always carrying me around like a human backpack while they try to do their job. It was a very unusual project even back then when it was greenlit in 2010. So I did 18 months formally between 2010 and 2012, and that was over 1,000 hours. And then I did another 500 hours between 2013 and 15, but in a less formal and less structured way for another project. But to answer your question, early on, I think it took some getting used to, because to my knowledge, I'm the only one of 2 reporters that's ever done that. Wow. So it was unusual even back then. Today it's unthinkable. I mean, I've said many times that project would, I don't think, ever get approved today. But it was...
And the reason is, you think that...
I think the political climate's different. Yeah. I think trust between law enforcement and members of the media has never been lower. I think... And even someone like me who's been around for 18 years and has a track record that anybody can look at, and you'd like to think you have a certain professional reputation. But I still don't think that would climb over the political obstacles that would exist today. So, so today I say it's unthinkable, but it was very unusual even at the time. I think the only other time it had been done was in 1989 on the East Coast with another reporter. So, but how did they accept me? I mean, I probably was split up between, over 2 years, 30 different deputies and officers, so it really depended on the person. But I got really close with some of them. I still talk to some of them today. I'm still friends with some of them today, all these years later. So they got used to it. Once they saw I wasn't going to do anything stupid and
like get yourself shot or anything like that.
Well, not do something that's going to jeopardize an investigation that's happening in real time, and not do anything that's going to cause them to have to be distracted from what they have to focus on. I mean, once they understood that I was figuring out how to not do that, then I think their comfort level went up. It would be interesting if you had them here to ask them.
Can you give us a sense of what the police officers or law enforcement officers are like, their psyche, like how do they operate? And there's a lot of talk about the bad cops that do bad things, and Give us a sense of what you experienced.
Well, I took a lot of heat for saying on Robert Harrison's podcast recently that I think there's more cerebrally stunted and mediocre journalists than there are bad cops. That definitely...
I don't think you'll get hit on our program for saying that.
That definitely caused plenty of tissues to get passed around certain quarters. But I stand by that.
Mm-hmm.
There's no question that some people in our profession have happily misled the public about the reality on the streets.
Yes.
And what the typical threat really is. It's not the officers, typically.
Right.
And what I saw in all that time when I was embedded was most of those officers and deputies were trying their hardest in an unassuming way to do a dangerous and pretty impossible job every night. And more often than not, the vast majority of the time, their conduct, their professionalism, and their actions were what the community would support, if not be proud of. And don't misunderstand me. I have seen and I have covered instances of reckless law enforcement tactics that have resulted in disaster, bad or lazy policing that has caused crimes to go unsolved, and in a few cases, individuals who never should have been able to wear a badge or have the public trust in their hand. So of course those situations need a spotlight. But when you have what we have now, which is a lot of activists masquerading as journalists that try to take those minority cases and portray an overarching reality, when the numbers don't bear it out, well, you tell me. I mean, that's narrative fraud.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's what I have seen sort of happen in media in the last 7 years or so.
Yeah. This may be a more philosophical question, but why, in your experience, isn't the drug problem, the addiction of the drug problem, able to be resolved in the U.S.? And I don't know if it's a U.S. problem or not, but what's the main driving force that keeps this going?
We've had a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of drug addiction for over 40 years in this country, but that misunderstanding was epitomized by the so-called war on drugs, which I've said in all these talks I do is a term of lunacy, because wars are fought and won by force of arms, and addiction is a cancer of the human spirit. One is not going to beat the other. What the war on drugs did was create a lot of mistrust and a lot of anger and resentment and community pain in specific neighborhoods and primarily in urban areas. It set a trajectory that for just an ongoing misunderstanding of what the issue is. The issue is cultures of hopelessness in this country. Addiction breeds in cultures of hopelessness. And I grew up in a poor rural community, which is part of the story in this book, and I understand well. Friends of mine that I grew up with have died or gone to prison, and I can tell you, having to write their stories and see their stories play out, it's about cultures of hopelessness, where you have these in the rural areas, you have these boom and bust economies that end up shuttering, and then there's no jobs. I saw this when I was traveling all over the country to do the other part of the field work for this book, is all these communities had something in common, and that's the factors, the employment, the industries that support these communities were outsourced away to other places, and along with that, any semblance of livability or hope. So of course you get a lot of people in these places that they can see a better time in the past they can't ever access again, and they don't see any hope in the future. And our addiction epidemic in this country, a lot of it comes from that, There's other factors, of course. Some folks experience extreme childhood trauma. Other people, have other life situations that bring them into it. But if we pull the lens back, we're talking about cultures of hopelessness. So you can't arrest your way out of a culture of hopelessness or incarcerate your way out of a culture of hopelessness. That doesn't mean you let drug traffickers and criminal operators run wild and do anything they want, because that's what I have seen. So I started 18 years ago. I've seen the pendulum sweep all the way around, right? When I started, there was still a little bit of that war on drugs mentality. I saw the twilight of it. I saw the end of it, where law enforcement officials and elected officials really began to understand that it wasn't doing anything but driving up the price tag for prisons and on a level we couldn't afford anymore. So, but we were still having this recidivism rate and these relapse rates, 85% relapse rates. The recidivism rates at some point were like 60, 70% in this state. So I saw the war on drugs was just kind of coming to an end when I started. But over time, we went from trying to reassess how we're going to deal with that. And I think you could say through all these criminal justice, some call them reforms, others call them experiments. I think you could say we brought a broadsword to an ocular surgery, because now we're all the way on the other side of the spectrum, where we have political leadership in this state that essentially appears to greenlight total disorder and drug offenders doing anything they want, committing any manner of crimes without consequence, and that degrades everyone's quality of life. Yeah. So you do have to have like a strong law enforcement component for crime containment, or you don't have a community.
Yes.
So when I say the war on drugs didn't work and created this huge misnomer that has caused a big fundamental misunderstanding of addiction, don't mistake that for thinking that means we don't need law enforcement or we don't need really good, well-funded law enforcement. We do, if we're going to have any kind of livable community that people want to be in. And if we want to stop hemorrhaging citizens from the state to Texas and Tennessee and Florida and everywhere else they're going, where they feel like their elected officials in those places take public safety way more seriously than we do.
Well, I want to ask you on both sides of the pendulum. And, you recently published a story that has to do with pretty much criminals being released and, without any remorse. But I want to ask you first, why specifically you think the war on drugs did not work out? You mentioned some examples, but what would you say is the gist of it?
I think it created an illusion that we could solve the addiction crisis without solving these foundational economic issues and class issues in this country that are causing so many people to give up on the American dream and give up on even the most basic, modest dream of a happy life in their community, right? Like, I think the war on drugs was a distraction from it just became a fairy tale that we told ourselves so we didn't have to work on these much, much more difficult things. And this is what's so demoralizing about being in the sphere of the criminal justice system in California, is we don't learn these lessons, My thinking about what I do has evolved over time. When I started out all those years ago, I thought naively that crime coverage was about documenting and making the public aware of the most extreme human experiences you can have in society. And if you just did that in an accurate and engaging way, you'd done a journalism good. You'd been part of the civic alarm system. You'd helped your reader armor themselves with a chainmail of knowledge, and they're all the better for it. They're theoretically safer. Well, that's more of a bedtime story we tell ourselves and each other so we can sleep at night. Those of us who don't sleep as well understand that meaningful crime reporting is actually bearing witness to highly contagious suffering, terminal trajectories for some neighborhoods, and this shrouded political borderland that neither side really wants to venture into because the truth inside it is so very ugly. And that truth is that the zealot intensity that both major parties bring to ideological gamesmanship around public safety and justice results in real pain, genuine torment for some people that they're going to experience the rest of their lives, whether it's losing someone to homicide, watching their community collapse, or being the victim of something that's going to make them unable to ever trust again. Now, I don't know, one wonders after so many years, like, do Californians really have the stomach to face this for what it is? We're more comfortable sticking with that surface level definition of crime stories I had as a cub reporter because we can turn it all into entertainment. America right now has a true crime entertainment industrial complex, so we don't have to think about these things.
I wonder if that's in any way similar to the homeless issue, where we use like one solution fits all. We say we need more money to build more shelters, but we don't look at the specific individual issues like mental illness or whatever else there is to address the issue.
For sure. And addiction is it's not the only force that's playing a role in the homeless population, but it's a huge addiction, and mental health issues play a big role in our homeless population. And we're just not been good as a society at solving these problems and finding ways to take the addiction crisis on in an effective way that works.
Please tell us about your latest piece that you just published in the Sacramento Review.
Yeah, so at midnight, I published a story in Sacramento News and Review, which is where I work as a crime and investigations reporter right now. And it was about a number of early paroles for extremely violent offenders in California. And this is not a case of them getting their very first parole hearing and being granted parole. It's not that. They're getting their parole hearings 5-6 years before they were ever supposed to get their first hearing. These are all murders and attempted murders and brutal facts in these cases, absolutely brutal. And, they're getting sentences of 15 years to life or 16 years to life, and they're getting paroled 10 years in. So when California passed Prop 57, I think a lot of voters didn't realize there was a line in it that essentially, at least this is how the California district attorneys are interpreting it, essentially empowered the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation to calculate credits for good behavior any way they wanted, with no transparency and no oversight. So it's become a black box. And if you're a victim and you're in the case I really use as a window in the story that published at midnight was a case of a 19-year-old who was murdered by a bunch of train hoppers. And he has a twin brother. And his twin brother's letter to the court after the murder is one of the saddest I've ever read in my career. So now his brother's finding out that the main killer is
released.
Yeah, released, and didn't even need to get to the bare minimum sentence, which was 15 years, to get the first parole hearing. They got 2 parole hearings before that and were released on the second one. So they got their first parole hearing like 6 years before they were supposed to. But it wasn't just that case. There's numerous cases cited in this piece.
Why is this happening? Why are these people being released ahead of time?
So there's been numerous changes to the law in the last 14 years.
You did mention the criteria of credits, but that cannot be verified.
So,
right?
well, I mean, the question is, why is the State Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation's calculating these credits in a mysterious way to let people out this early, even though it sort of spits in the face of the victims' family members and scares everyone in the communities these people are being released to? Like, why are they doing that? And why are they being completely non-transparent about the calculations, including to elected district attorneys, top law enforcement officers in any given county can't get any information about how these credits are being calculated? So why is that happening? Is that your question?
Yeah.
Well, essentially, there's a political mandate from the Democratic leadership in California to get the prison population as low as they can possibly get it before the public totally revolts. And now
again, we saw with Prop 47 that the public is starting to revolt.
Yeah,
in that way.
and the recall of several district attorneys that were at least portrayed as activists and not real prosecutors. They don't define themselves that way, but that was the public conversation. So between those recalls and the essential repeal of Prop 47, the public mood is changing with a sense of, a sense that there's just a lot more disorder and that people are no longer seeing deterrence to extremely antisocial behavior. Yeah. So, I mean, when you can, as a journalist, if you confront Democratic leadership about this in California, of course, like they don't characterize what's happening that way. They like to say that they're being smarter on crime rather than tougher on crime. That's a term that I've heard first start cropping up about 14 years ago. Various state senators and people with the after Schwarzenegger left and Jerry Brown came in, people around the governor's office started using these terms, right? And it's a good slogan, right? Who doesn't want to be smarter about something, yes, right? Yes. And when that slogan is sort of castigating tough on crime, well, that's an allusion to the failures of the drug war, right? So that was a really effective slogan because it's kind of alluding to this sort of failure we talked about earlier, and it's promising something better because you're going to be smarter and more strategic and surgical about how you handle these crimes. But as I said, it was anything but. It was, like I said, it's bringing a broadsword to an ocular surgery. Mm-hmm. They just made sweeping changes between AB 109, Prop 47, and Prop 57. And they created a whole new legal framework in this state where there's just not only is there less punishment and less rehabilitation going on, but there's very little accountability with these state offices either. They also created a framework for that, and that's what you're seeing. When the top law enforcement official in Sacramento County or Placer County can't get any information about how a state bureaucrat is calculating good behavior for a person who's murdered individuals and are about to get released back into the community years and years before they were supposed to be out, then you've got a real lack of accountability that came out of that framework, right?
I'd like to go back to the addiction issue. And addiction, like we said, it's a big factor in all of this. And we talk about addiction to drugs. Have you experienced or had, examples of things that happen, other addictions, being, even video games or whatever?
So I've been writing about addiction my entire career. I wrote an entire book about meth addiction, and after that, the heroin phenomena began and then morphed into the fentanyl crisis. So, and I've interviewed I used to have to keep track for these grants, so it's over 300 addicts on paper, but it's far more than that. It's far more than that. I stopped keeping track after those grants, but like it was, it's over, it's hundreds of addicts now I've spoken to, either formally or informally. I think the next horizon of addiction in this country is tech addiction. And I worry it could soon become a greater destructive force in the social fabric than anything we've ever encountered before. I could see a very near future where tech addiction is destroying more lives and causing more isolation than meth and heroin and fentanyl, or gambling addiction or sex addiction or whatever it would be.
That's a big statement, especially from you being involved with all these addictions.
Well, think about this.
We already know about the social media addiction that's doing what it's doing to kids, and
there's 34, 38 different state attorney generals that have launched essentially a RICO case against Meta over that. Mm-hmm. And that complaint's interesting to read, because just like the similar civil RICO case that was brought against the pharmaceuticals over oxycodone and Opana and drugs like that, it's alleging that Meta had information, that it had data, that it knew that it was causing addiction and self-harm and suicidal ideation, particularly around teenage girls, through Instagram. And so that's what the complaint alleges from all these different state attorney generals across the country. So there's that in real time. But when I'm talking about a near future where it's worse, I mean, I have known people who are getting addicted to AI relationship bots right now, and they have all the classic hallmarks of addiction: hiding and concealing behavior, living a double life, internalizing self-loathing, and engaging in behavior that's not only disruptive to their daily lives, but disruptive to the people they're closest to around them. These are all bellwethers for addiction, right? And that's just with the chatbots you can play with on your phone right now. And certain companies now have created specifically relationship chatbots, right? Yeah. But just imagine when these bots are better, and with the everything that happened with DeepSeek the last couple of weeks, like, what is the timeline for that? How could you predict that? But just imagine a near future where the bots are slightly better, and they are seamlessly and ubiquitously and affordably merged with VR tech, like wearable VR tech.
Yeah.
It won't.
It's a scary thought.
It won't just be. God, it sounds so dark, but it won't just be people creating boyfriends and girlfriends, or creating facsimiles of someone they wanted to be with that they can't be with. Like, that will happen immediately when that moment comes, right? That'll be happening all the time. There'll be all these questions of people's likeness and personal autonomy, that like could become legal questions, right? But it's just going to be human nature that some people that are going through some kind of grieving process are going to create digital echoes of people they've lost. Dead children, dead spouses, someone who left you in a divorce and won't talk to you anymore. What is the addictive power of that? I feel like no one is talking about this right now. And I don't feel like our public health apparatus is preparing for it. They're still thinking that's the holodeck on Star Trek or whatever. Right. No, it's.
It all seems to go full speed into that anyway. As far as the AI,
we know that's going to happen.
Yeah.
We know that's going to happen. So, why are we not trying to calculate what that addictive force, the weight of that addictive force, is going to be? We have people. We're not good at getting people clean from meth and and heroin and opioids. We can't even deal with that, as we've been talking about. Now imagine virtual spaces that are unhealthy and isolating, but have that same narcotic effect on your brain. So I think tech is the next horizon for addiction, and it worries me that that there's very little conversation about how fast this could arrive, and if we don't know how to solve drug addiction and alcohol addiction, I mean, what is the plan for that?
Well, I'm glad there's people like yourself who are at least bringing this out in the open, at least for consideration.
I've written some think pieces about this, but I'm just one journalist, Even some of the best tech reporters in the country, I haven't seen a lot of pieces about this from them. I think they're probably just trying to deal with all these developments in real time and stay on top of it in a incremental way. Yeah. But I don't see I don't think it's looking too far down the road that moment's going to come when these chatbots and a great wearable VR tech come together in a way you can afford and are just, tentacles on your brain and your psyche. Right. Mark Zuckerberg did an interview a few weeks ago with Joe Rogan that, if you actually listen to it carefully, it sounds like it probably does exist. It's just not on the market or something very close. Mm-hmm. I would encourage people to really hear what he's saying when they're having that conversation, because I do not think this is far down the road.
Scott, on a personal note, how did you get involved in crime reporting? I think you mentioned before that you grew up in an environment that was poor, and then you had these connections with the environment that guided you into getting into this.
It's not something I thought about a lot. The first 15 years, or the first 14 years of my career, I never gave it any thought. How did I end up being one of the few professional crime reporters in Northern California? And it was only through the course of working on a podcast documentary the last few years that I really reassessed that whole question of how, if there were maybe some subconscious forces that brought me here. So when I was a kid, the serial killer Leonard Lake came to my house several times, and my mom was one of his intended targets. And after he was caught, she survived that, but 17 other men, women, and children did not. And after he was caught, and both of her best friends, two of her really close friends had a bunch of encounters with him too, so it was always being discussed. From the time I was 8 years old on, my brother, who was 6 at the time, and he and I have talked about this, that conversation was always going on. Leonard Lake was part of a duo team of serial killers, the other being Charles Ng. And they lived in the town that was closest to me, West Point, actually a little hamlet outside of West Point called Wilseyville. And they kidnapped people from the Bay Area, and they kidnapped people from my community, and they held them in this torture chamber and killed them over time. Videotaped some of their crimes, unfortunately. And I grew up with that story just woven into my sort of life as a kid, right? And I never really thought about if it played any role. It never crossed my mind. And then what happened was I was talking to an entertainer in Sacramento one day, and she said, "You're doing all this crime reporting. Why don't you turn this crime reporting into a podcast?" And I told her, I just don't have a lot of interest in that right now. I'm really focused on trying to do these complicated pieces of long form journalism about really sort of Byzantine homicide cases. And then she said, "Well, it's just these podcasts about serial killers are huge." And I told her, I got on a little bit of a soapbox, and I said, I have more interest in recarpeting your recording studio than writing about serial killers. And she was like, "Well, why?" And I was like, "Because that's all I heard growing up since the time I was 8 years old was talk about serial killers." And I mentioned this thing that had happened. And she was the one who was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. She's like, you've been interviewed by NPR in like 4 or 5 different states about crime and you've never mentioned this. And I said I would never think to. It's completely irrelevant to anything I do. She was the one who suggested, like, what if it might explain everything you do? So I started working on a documentary podcast series after I realized that, like, another kid on my street grew up to become a homicide detective, the most decorated homicide detective in his agency. And another kid I grew up with became this well-regarded songwriter who writes murder ballads about the backwoods. It all started to come together in my mind like there was a downstream effect generationally on the kids from Generation X who grew up in that town under this shadow. So I started working on this project. It's a 5-part podcast documentary called Trace of the Devastation that really looks... I had access to one of the original detectives in that case, and he's a pivotal voice throughout the entire documentary. He walks the listener through the entire investigation and how it unfolded, and it's surreal because to think that I was around, I was like a kid as he was doing all this stuff. I happen to know the top reporter on the case too. He's a colleague of mine in Sacramento, but back in the day that he was this rookie crime reporter who was turning into international story. And it's like, it's crazy to think that I go to lunch meetings with him, but he was also in my town when I was 8 doing this story, right? And it's funny because after it came out, I did some public talks around Northern California in front of crowds for it. And people will always want to ask you if they haven't listened. They'll want to compare it to something they know. So since it's a crime podcast, they'll be like, is it like Serial? Is it like Culpable? Is it like To Live and Die in LA? Which are all fine products. But I tell them, like, I think of it in spirit more like the movie Stand By Me, or maybe even not literally, but maybe even like Stephen King's It, in the sense that it's about these kids having to come to terms with the reality of evil in the world and what that means for them as they grow up and become the people they become. So that's what the project's been about. So I'm giving you a much different answer than if you'd asked me even 5 years ago. I would have told you it was coincidental probably. I never thought about it in these terms until recently.
Well, Scott, I think the work you do is so important, bringing awareness to these issues like addiction and the dangers of tech and AI and what these can create to the society. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah.
I appreciate it. Thank you for watching another episode of the Bay Area Innovators. If you have a suggestion for someone who should be on our program, we would love to hear from you. Please send us an email at sfbay@epochtimes.com. Thank you for watching and see you next week.